Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 2nd of May. Today we're covering key events that occurred on the 30th of April and the 1st of May, including important changes around the Avdiivka front. We'll look at Chasiv Yar, Robotyne, Kupiansk. We'll look at actually the Ukrainian missile strikes using ATACMS that targeted a Russian training facility 80 kilometers east of the line of contact. And we'll also look at a Russian strike. They released footage a couple of hours ago of strikes targeting two HIMARS launchers in Kharkiv Oblast. And as we're on this topic of strikes, then there was actually a strike that we received footage of just an hour or two ago from southern Odessa. There were reported to be at least two Iskander-M ballistic missile strikes on the city targeting the Nova Poshta warehouses. And this is Ukraine's one of their private delivery services. And so in southern Odessa, they have this rather large facility, and you could see some of the warehouses and buildings over here that may have been the target, because we don't have the specific explanation for what the Russians were aiming to damage and destroy. But we do have this exact geolocation, and we do know that over the past day or two, the Russian forces have been launching several waves of Iskander ballistic missiles on the city. I think it was just yesterday when they launched a round of these missiles with their cluster warheads. And so I think right now it's reported that in this strike from tonight, there are at least 13 casualties. And now let's go to the situation around Avdiivka, because this is where we have the most significant developments. And it's really on point with a lot of what I've talked about over a week now. And so I don't want to rehash everything again and again each video, but we will cover very quickly the fact that the Russian forces on the 29th and then going into the 30th, they continued expanding their zone of control to the west of Ocheretyne, taking advantage of their positions on the ridge that runs along the rail line and the adjacent road where I have this arrow marked, and they continued advancing westwards. And in the process of doing so, they captured this particular stronghold that I said the Ukrainians had an interest in holding on to. And the reason why is because that stronghold was really supposed to be, in theory, the vanguard protecting this road that connects the rail line to Alexandrivka, and then also protects the northern flank of key Ukrainian defensive nodes around Sokil and other villages that are to the east of the Vovcha River. And so it follows through that now the Russians have control of this trend system, this stronghold per deep state, that now the Russian forces will be able to undermine those Ukrainian defensive and logistical hubs. And so what we're seeing is, first of all, that advance to the west, but also the Russian forces on the 30th of April expanding control along the ridgeline that runs north along this particular vector, and getting control of additional fields. There are a few trenches in this area, but it is mainly open field. So the Russian forces advanced, you could say, about a kilometer, 1.2 kilometers northwards. And in the process, they're getting close to really paving the way for an assault on Nova Alexandrivka, which is an important village. And I'll explain why. First of all, it's guarded by this one trench line that the Russian forces are looking to cut off. They're looking to, get control of the outskirts and of the road leading into it, so then they have a more comfortable route of attacking it. And this is an area where some Ukrainian units have tried to consolidate the line around. You do have, for instance, 100th Mechanized Brigade around here. And there is a strong point where there may be some regrouping attempts by infantry squads. But the point is, Nova Alexandrivka, and if you go further north and then northwest, all of this region is located in rather low elevation. It's just an entire valley. It's just a particular river valley. I don't know the name of the river, but all these various villages located within these two green lines, they are just all on valleys overlooked by the ridges on which the fields to the south and to the east are currently positioned. And along the road that goes through Nova Alexandrivka and then continues going northwest all the way to the ring road on the T0504 highway. And that highway, if you zoom out, it actually connects. You can't really see it well on the map because of the icons, but it connects from Bakhmut to then Chasiv Yar and then to Konstantinivka, which we've talked about a lot. And that makes its way all the way to the west to Pokrovsk, which is a very important Ukrainian city that we've talked about already. in terms of where longer range artillery is being stored, in terms of command and control centers, in terms of logistics, reinforcements. In every single way imaginable, it is an important node for the Ukrainian forces, especially as you get additional supplies coming to southern Donetsk or to the Donbass line further east. So it is very important, really important area that the Ukrainians want to maintain cohesiveness around, would not want supply lines cut. They don't want to sever the connection between such a key node to the line of contact. And so the Russian forces definitely long term, I'm not saying this is any sort of immediate projection, but definitely they have a goal of getting control of the entrance to this road and then advancing along this particular river valley. And then at this point, once you cross into this third arrow, it's already on higher elevation, and that's the point where you reach the Donetsk, or not Donetsk, but just this particular ring road that is located on that highway. And as we said in previous videos, the Russian forces now have an opportunity to exploit their gains west of Ocheretyne to begin undermining Ukraine's various layers of defense that they've been trying to set up east of the Vovcha River. Vovcha River, if you don't recall, I'll mark it in blue for you guys. It's over here. This is a fallback line that the Ukrainian forces would not want to withdraw to immediately. They'd want to do staggered withdrawals over an extended period of time to give their forces on those fallback lines an opportunity to connect various strongholds together to make the next line of defense further and further westwards at least more solid and more well connected. And so you have these various stages that you see marked in blue over here that the Ukrainians would want to maintain for as long as possible, and that includes Sokil. Sokil is sort of like this node that's connecting together the entrance and the exit points to then various other villages that are east of the Vovcha River, and it does have its own strong point over here, and so they would not want to lose that village. And now the Russian forces are, first of all, overlooking it. They overlook all of the Vovcha River Valley and all of its various gullies that extend eastwards that you see marked in blue. And of course, they could flank it from the north. And so that's a real concern. It's a pertinent issue for Ukrainian forces here that they need to ensure their northern flank is protected. And at the same time, you do have direct assaults, not even from the flank, but just specifically from Solovyove by Russian forces. You have the initial probing assaults and then larger armored attacks that have started to occur. So far, the Russian forces have not been able to penetrate into Sokil, which I think is understandable on the first attempt, especially when you have the 47th Brigade still organizing around here. Although it is heavily attrited and exhausted, they do still have the defensive capabilities to, at least for a short period of time, push back the Russians. Although this by no means it does not mean that they will be able to maintain positions over here for any extended period of time. What the 47th Brigade says is that they were able to repel a Russian armored assault. I think they said it was 2 tanks and 5 infantry fighting vehicles or various armored vehicles like MTLBs that were organizing around Solovyove. And that should tell you that the Russian forces have already moved in armored assets from the Avdiivka area where they were previously stationed all the way to the northwest, going like 6, 7, 8 kilometers, and already are in Ocheretyne, already are in frontline towns like Solovyove, and are prepared to advance along these key roads, these paved roads, and take losses as is necessary to then dismount infantry and overrun Ukrainian frontline positions. And so that's what we're starting to see. We have a geolocation here which shows one such Russian vehicle that was destroyed by the Ukrainians on the road to Sokil. And so you've had several of these incidents now that the 47th Brigade is releasing footage of. Specifically, we're seeing a lot from their strike drones company, so their FPV unit. So first of all, this video here does give us confirmation of a Russian advance along this road, and the fact that the Ukrainians abandoned some of their defensive lines that run parallel to that road, trying to consolidate further westwards. And I think it was FPV fire that targeted this vehicle. But we saw a larger clip come out of Solovyove where you had several Russian vehicles advancing along this road and trying to then advance along this particular, I guess, dirt path, you could say, further south. And in the process, they were spotted by the 47th Brigade. One tank was hit by an FPV drone before it was targeted by artillery, and then it was basically caught in a standstill and hit by the drone. There were also 2 MTLBs that were destroyed by the Ukrainian fire in western Solovyove. One was by a combination of various types of, whether it be drones, whether it be fire from infantry fighting vehicles, artillery. So one of them was destroyed by an amalgamation of fire types, and then the other one was destroyed specifically by the M242 Bushmaster chamber gun. So those are the 25 millimeter rounds that the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle utilizes as it fired towards that Russian armored vehicle. And on top of that Russian armored vehicle, you had this sort of like camouflage netting. It's not supposed to be any sort of like physical protection, but it's supposed to physically conceal them and try to blend in with the environment. But even from where I was standing, where I was looking at from the drone footage, it's pretty clear that there were soldiers, and it's a pretty large amount of soldiers in this case, like an infantry squad that is mounted above the MTLB and trying to hide under that protective canopy. And they were targeted by the chamber gun fire. But again, this is what is expected to happen when you have these initial assaults. I saw that the same thing at a much larger scale when the Russian forces were assaulting around Tonenke. And it also means that the Russian forces are continuing with their attempts at advancing, and that they're not taking any sort of operational pauses at the moment. Additionally, by the 30th of April, basically all sources, regardless of side, were in unison, agreeing that Novokalinove and Keramik were under full Russian control. This was again verified by deep states. On their mapping, it looks pretty much something like this. Rybar disputes it, saying that this major stronghold located west of Keramik is also under Russian control. For now, marking it as a gray zone, but the point is that the Ukrainians have withdrawn from many of their advantageous positions that are south of Arkhangelsk, and a lot of these were on higher elevation, like these fields over here. But simply, you could tell by the strong Russian Russian flanks to the east and west that it would be untenable for Ukrainians to hold fort positions in such an area. And so now the Russian forces have control over these two villages. They have a strong presence over here with some fresh units that are prepared to continue advancing westwards and begin enveloping Arkhangelsk. They also have a strong component that is around Ocheretyne, and as we've talked about, is also advancing to the west and to the north in the areas that are directly to the west of Arkhangelsk. As you can see, the envelopment is now forming. The village that the Ukrainians have withdrawn to and solidified control using various mechanized units and territorial defense units. It is now in a very precarious position. Not all of its supply routes have been cut off. You have the main supply route running along this lower lying valley that goes further north to Kalinove and Stara Mykolaievka, for instance. But you have the horizontal supply routes there now under heavy Russian bombardment. The village itself is under heavy Russian bombardment, and these sort of trench strongholds are. And so it is becoming more and more untenable for the Ukrainians to hold positions in this region. And you could see the envelopment occur and the storming happen in the short term. And the reason why it would be important for the Russian forces to do so is because Arkhangelsk is not the end goal here. There are further Russian targets further north, and the way for the Russian forces to really gain the cohesiveness and momentum to continue advancing northwards, and a lot of that would also happen in parallel with Russian armored columns advancing along the H20 highway, but that can only be done if they get rid of this Ukrainian presence in Arkhangelsk. Not because the Ukrainians could counterattack. At this point, they really don't exhibit the capability to do so. The best they can do is try to extend try to make the pace of the Russian gains slower in the sector at the current point in time. But it would be much better for Russian connectivity in order for them to, organize together and continue advancing along various vectors to just get rid of this Ukrainian presence here and then get a more unified control of the salient located to the northwest of Avdiivka that could advance again along various vectors as needed. And so the fall of Arkhangelsk would then give the Russian forces the momentum they need to advance further northwards, take over Kalinove. And at that point, you could see how the undermining of the Ukrainian defense line over here would begin to unfold, especially if you had a concurrent Russian assault in the ridge fields just to the west of Kalinove. That would give the Russians the proper, high ground supports to overlook the various valleys or ravines where there's fighting going on, and then overlook the trenches that the Ukrainians set up even further eastwards, like you see in these two parallel blue lines around Sukha-Balka. And so that's, again, more of a long-term Russian objective because they don't want to be stuck at this line that the Ukrainians have hastily prepared. This line is meant as a way to protect the town of New York in the long term because they don't want the Russians beginning to assault New York from its western flank. And the best way for the Russian forces to do so would be to just completely undermine the Ukrainian defenses that you see in yellow that are forming this sort of like curved shape in blue over here, this curved line. They would want to subvert it from the west particularly, but also subvert it along the H-20 highway, take over key strongholds and key heights that are located south of these trenches, including villages such as Alexandropol, and at that point have a solid base that could cut off supply lines along this particular road that you see I marked in X. That would sever the connectivity between the Ukrainian positions located around here, for instance, I'm marking in red, and within the Toretsk, New York zone. And so the way to do that would be to, again, get a large amount of momentum and attacks going, combining mechanized forces and infantry forces in the area west of New York. But I'll get into much more detail about that in additional videos. Now moving on to the Chasiv Yar front, we do have some developments for the first time in a while. So for 2 weeks, you could say, the Russian forces did have an operational pause around here. And a lot of it has to do with the fatigue that was experienced by the paratrooper units in this region, which is understandable because they did really begin launching their significant attacks mainly on BMDs and MTLBs around Avdiivka, for instance, in early December, I believe. And of course, there were several pauses in between of several weeks, but it does all add up. And so now we had this 2-week period where the Russian forces were still active on the artillery and airstrike front, targeting various Ukrainian forward positions in the Canal District and then also within Chasiv Yar. But in terms of any sort of ground attack, that didn't really happen. The Ukrainians in this period of time were likely able to regain positions on the outskirts of the Canal District, including in the forested areas, the dachas, and then further south as well. And so now the Russian forces have resumed their assaults, and we are seeing them do this in 2 areas. The first area is directly within the Canal District, where the Russian forces are trying to reclaim some lost territory on its eastern approaches. So you have Russian forward echelons that are establishing positions in trenches and the ruins of houses and dugouts that are located in or around this forested area, and then from there advancing to the road that's basically the entrance, Zelena Street, the entrance to the Canal District. And this is all verified by videos from the Russian side, or from the Ukrainian side, which show the shelling of those Russian forces, whether it be actual artillery shelling, whether it be drones dropping grenades or FPV strikes on Russian infantry as they're located in these houses. And then we also have a similar video from the Ukrainian side over here a bit further north, which shows drone drops on Russian soldiers. And this is in an area that the Russians hitherto had not had under their control. And again, that should give you an idea of the fact that the Russians are trying to gradually broaden control of these various key points just on the perimeter to try to get more favorable positions before any sort of head-on assault, because the Canal District, although it is small, does have extremely difficult targets that cannot be overrun directly. It would be very costly. You look at the apartment buildings in the region, you look at the industrial facilities, you do not want to assault those head-on. And that's why the Russian forces in sync are also advancing further south. And they're doing so along the Stupki Golubovsky Nature Reserve. You could see it marked over here in this red rectangle. It is an area that does still have pretty good tree coverage, a lot of foliage. In comparison, this forested area over here has much less. It has to do with the shelling and counter shelling by both sides, and there's a bit less of that over here. And so the Russian forces did find it easier to advance using that concealment, taking over key Ukrainian trench positions located on its perimeter, and actually making it all the way to the crossing, the land physical crossing past the Donbass Canal. You can see that based on this geolocated video from the 41st Mechanized Brigade. It shows drones dropping grenades, of course, as they always do in these videos, onto Russian soldiers in trenches in the nature reserve, where you do have, again, the trenches, but also under the canal pipeline, because as you can see, this is a part of the canal that you do actually have a physical crossing where soldiers could get across. But then you have these two pipelines that connect the two water sections, the one to the north and then the other canal section to the south together. And so under those two pipelines, you do have these ditches that were dug, and so Russian soldiers were hiding under them to avoid the grenades targeting them. And so that's verification that the Russian forces have been able to advance all the way to this position westward. And so over the past couple of days, the Russian forces have been able to advance 1.2 kilometers in this direction. And it is important, not because it's going to completely undermine the Donbass Canal line, because that would simply be impossible given the width of the line, which spans from the north of Chasiv Yar to the south, and even more than that. It consists of various forested areas that the Ukrainians are using. It consists of various ridges that the Ukrainians control. But it is one area where the Russian forces, if they could solidify control, would have a longer term base to then launch attacks across that canal and south of Chasiv Yar. And so that is important to look out for any sort of attempted Ukrainian counterattack, because we know that the Russians, they destroyed a Ukrainian T-64 in the same area. I think it was in this position over here. It's from a video from yesterday. And then we also have, of course, the fact that the Russians are advancing on the southern flank of the Canal District. And so this could be a way for the Russians to avoid a head-on assault, because although they could still do that, it would divert Ukrainian resources and sort of reduce the blow by also attacking from the southern vector where you don't have as many Ukrainian prepared defenses. Now moving on to Urozhaine, we do have yet another change. The changes are still rather insignificant in terms of the scale, but you could see this is the polygon showing the extent of the Russian advances in recent days. And some of these gains were also verified by deep states. And in addition, we do have additional movement based on this geolocation, which shows a Ukrainian FPV strike on various Russian infantry in several warehouses within southern Urozhaine. And so we got the first videos of a Russian presence a couple of days ago, with presumably Russian vehicles advancing along this road and then dismounting their troops. And in the days since then, the Russian forces have continued sending in additional infantry squads, and they're occupying the various warehouses. We don't see any sort of Ukrainian ground attempt at a counterattack, which would be something that if they had the manpower and the wherewithal to do, it would seem wise for them to do so at the earlier stages of such a Russian attempt at gaining a foothold in such a village on the line of contact. But for now, I've changed the map to just show that the rest of the warehouses are a gray zone and that the Russian forces have not finished their attacks, although they are still occurring on rather small scale. An area where it is on a bit of a larger scale is Robotyne. So as I talked about in my last video, and I said that there would probably be a geolocation by the time I released the video, we have this location over here showing that the 2nd Battalion of the 71st Motorized Rifle Regiment raised the Russian flag in northern Robotyne. And that's a verification of the northernmost advance. We also know that the Russian forces solidified control over much of southern and central Robotyne, but there are some parts of the northeastern perimeter that still may not be cleared. We also know that there were some Ukrainian infantry squads that were filmed by Russian drone crews as they were withdrawing from the village, and so that was probably occurring around this lower lying area just in the north of Robotyne, advancing along the highway or retreating along this particular set of tree lines. But the point is that the Russian forces, by advancing along Robotyne, they also got control over this trench system that the Ukrainians had previously held to secure the flank of whatever was left of their control in Robotyne. Now the Russian forces have control over these fortifications that they built as a part of the Zherebets line, or not even the Zherebets line, because Zherebets line is here. There's just some lines or some fortifications that were built as a sort of precursor to the Zherebets line. And so now a lot of those defenses are being retaken by the Russians, and the ones that haven't yet been retaken, the Ukrainians are trying to utilize them for their own defenses. And so for now, you do still have a certain presence of Ukrainian infantry squads of the 65th Mechanized Brigade on the perimeter of Robotyne. You do see a lot of the defenses here that they are still occupying. They're also occupying a lot of dugouts and tree lines located in these fields, and you can see how the salient is being formed here, and they're still present in that area. You also have some National Guard presence, And so that area is right now in a very dangerous situation because as the Russian forces continue to consolidate control over Robotyne, and they already do have, due to their VDV elements, solid control of the areas west of the Zherebets line over here, it will become increasingly difficult for Ukrainian forces to continue to send forces several kilometers southwards towards such a dangerous zone in the line of contact. In the area where I have my arrows pointed is also located on extremely low elevation that's overlooked by both of the Russian flanks. Robotyne itself is not located on that low of an elevated surface, and Verbove and the nearby areas are on a ridge. But the villages, or the fields, sorry, in between, they are actually located on very low elevation overlooked by the Russian controlled flanks. And so you could see how eventually the Ukrainians are going to be squeezed out of this area either by force or by their own attempts at withdrawing. And what this means for the longer term prospects is that now the Russian forces will have a forward position to fire upon Ukrainian forces that are located on the valleys that are basically running along this highway, for instance, that leads into Novodolnivka to the north and towards Ocheretyne, which again is also has its own elevation issues as it's the epicenter of several smaller streams that connect together. So it is on this more of a floodplain sort of surface, lower elevation. And then, of course, a lot of these fields located north of Robotyne will be exposed. The area that might not be as exposed is like this Balka Uspenivska area. This is a ridge. There's a ridge that runs over here, and I think it's an extension of the Verbove ridge. And that area is on a bit of a higher elevated surface, and so those areas won't fall without a fight, of course, and they're also fortified to a certain extent and have some sort of tree coverage. But a lot of these other fields over here, it's simply going to be untenable for Ukraine to hold a large amount of assets, a large amount of men in an area with such extensive Russian coverage overlooking them in open fields. We also have a short update on the Luhansk fronts. Over the past 2 weeks, we could say the Ukrainians have regained some positions that are just east of Yampolivka. This is because the Russian forces have become more passive on this front. We're not seeing as many infantry attacks trying to overrun forested patches or any sort of armored formation trying to advance along main roads towards the Zherebets River. We're just not seeing that anymore. It seems like this is a lower priority for the Russians at the moment. And the Ukrainian forces in this region, that there are some stronger units over here associated with the National Guard or other mechanized forces that are in the area, and then there's a bit of a wide variety here because you also have some less experienced territorial defense forces. But the point is that the forces on the front line for the Ukrainians, they took advantage of the Russian passiveness around here and started to retake some lost positions in order to extend the buffer zone before the Russian forces reach Yampolivka. And so now, based on the most recent Russian advances, which I'll mark in blue over here with these blue lines, you can see them. The Russian forces are now, if we measure it, I think it's about 2.7 kilometers to the east of Yampolivka, and they do still hold positions that are relatively close to Terny, so it will be interesting to see if the Ukrainians have the wherewithal to push back the Russians in these forested patches over here. And lastly, around the village of Kyslivka, as you guys all know, the Russian forces, they got control of the rail station in eastern parts of Kyslivka, and then on the 30th of April, I believe it was, Deep State reported that there was an additional Russian advance. The Russian advance consisted of taking over the final blocks of eastern Kyslivka and then advancing in the fields directly to the south of it. And so now the Russian forces are preparing for the operation to storm Kotlyarivka, which is the village located just to the south, which is enveloped on three sides. It is a difficult node for the Ukrainians to defend, but taking over western Kyslivka and Kotlyarivka would be the first stage in eliminating this cluster of four towns that the Ukrainians have been using to basically prevent the Russians from using the highway to reach all the way to Kupiansk and nearby Ukrainian defensive structures.